Hello friends, we've been doing this series for quite some time, and today is the penultimate session of this series. After the session next month, we'll be winding it up and starting another one. And in this series, in this particular session of the series, we have one of the greatest 19th, 20th century writers from Russia to discuss from the perspective of the short story. He was mainly a novelist. I'm talking of Tolstoy. He was mainly a novelist and a very serious person. So much serious that he wouldn't have written much of comic writing, much of comedy. But then, in seriousness, in depth, and in fact, even in the tragic sense, I believe he has no match so far as the contemporary world writing is concerned. So Tolstoy's short story, you can call it a novella also. It's a long story in fact, and it's a short novel. The death of Ivan Ilyich. We have selected that for discussion today, and we treat it as a short story because this is the series on the short story. And for this particular session, we have Professor Payal Nagpal, who teaches English in Janki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University, and she has done an in-depth study of the Russian fiction, and she would be the aptest person to share her views with us on this short story and on Tolstoy's vision in particular. So without further discussion, I invite Professor Nagpal to give us a point or two to discuss to start with, and later on it can be dealt with in a bit of length. That's what it is, and so please begin.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. As you mentioned that today we will be discussing what is referred to as a novella, short fiction, and we've included it in our series of the short story. It's titled The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And I think the points that you made about the kind of seriousness that is there in Tolstoy's writing, it is very remarkable. And at the same time, what I think there is a kind of control that he exercises in expressing this seriousness so that the reader is not swayed by the tragic outcome or by the tragic undertones and overtones in the writing, but the writer is able to still stand somewhat at a distance and try and ask questions and understand what Tolstoy is writing about, be it a short story, be it the novel. And there is great precision also in his writing. The style is slightly different from the way he writes in his novels. But I think the remarkable aspect is this, that the tragic aspect of the story or the plot, it's not something that weighs heavy on the reader. The reader is able to balance it out with the kind of observations that the reader might have and the kind of questions that a reader might want to actually ask after reading. So we'll begin with just a brief look at Tolstoy's, the times to which Tolstoy belonged, more than, stating that it's about his life. So we know that, he of course belonged to the aristocracy. He was a count, and, he had a title, and in that sense, Russia in those days, the world was feudal. So he was born in 1828 and he lived up to 1910, which pretty much means, the world had completely changed from a world that was, grappling to industrialize, was dealing with the word machine, with industry, with capital, to a world that was, in a few years, getting ready for a kind of war situation. So Tolstoy has lived through a very, very interesting long period here, and he's known for two very famous novels, War and Peace, which was written around the 1860s, broadly 1865 to 69, and Anna Karenina, that's around 1875 to 1877. And we see that there is a deep concern about the way in which the writer would like to understand society. And when we talk about Russian fiction, we begin with the writer Gogol, and then there are writers like Ivan Turgenev, and how there is a kind of realism that comes in. But with Tolstoy, who's writing in the 1860s, where realism itself has undergone a kind of change, and there is a sense of interiority, the psychological, these aspects also start becoming very, very important. And which is how at the turn of the century, finally, writing itself is going to undergo a great change. A novella like the short story that we've taken up, Death of Ivan Ilyich, is published around 1886, and so it's a vast span that we are really speaking looking at. Uh, Tolstoy was greatly influenced by writers like Laurence Sterne, by Charles Dickens, and Rousseau. It's believed that he wore a medallion of Rousseau actually, and not really a cross. And so, and I think the impact of the kind of realism that Dickens had showed in his writing, and the element of the psychological that Sterne, displayed, which is much earlier. I think all these elements are to be seen in Tolstoy's writing, and in that sense, the death of Ivan Ilyich, I think, displays all these strands of expression. So it's interesting to note that he was, after a point, he was extremely critical of institutions of religion, of the church, and he believed that it kind of corrupted Christianity, and the message that Christianity conveyed was actually different. And so he converted to what was called a new idea of faith that appeared at the time. At the same time, he was very connected, though of course he belonged to the feudal aristocracy, but he was also very connected to the peasantry, and he at one point also organized a school for the peasant children. Pedagogy became an important, what really is education and how it is to be conveyed was important for him. He was excommunicated by the Russian Orthodox Church in 1901. If we look at some important determining historical events, as mentioned, from Gogol's realism to Turgenev, as an anecdote, it's interesting how he had challenged Turgenev to a duel, which of course never took place. And Turgenev and they always had a lot of difference of thought. And though much later, it's believed Turgenev appreciated him and said that he should never give up on his writing. To sum up the 1880s, the decade to which the death of Ivan Ilyich belongs, so we look at how the Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in 1881, and this was followed by the student riots of 1882 in St. Petersburg. And 1891, Tolstoy renounces all copyright on his works published after 1881, and he felt that it was just profit making. And so prior to 1881, everything went to his wife, but after that, he refused to take any profits from his writing, and he raised the question of what is art. With this, we actually move to an understanding and analysis of the short fiction, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. If you look at the title itself, generally at this time, people were writing biographies and Bildungsroman and so on. And here we have a story that begins and announces the death of its protagonist, Ivan Ilyich. So in a sense, the story has ended before it has begun, and we already know the plot. There's no curiosity. Everything has been dispelled. So now this was actually also based on a real incident of the death of Ivan Ilyich Mechnikov, who died from stomach cancer, who's a judge. And Tolstoy also actually, met people who had been sentenced by him, to Siberia, and there were people who had committed very, they were sent to Siberia for very, very trivial reasons. So, but this incident formed the basis of what turned out to be one of the most remarkable works, actually, by Tolstoy. And it's one has to kind of quote Maupassant here, who says that I realized that when he read The Death of Ivan Ilyich, it is believed he said that I realized that everything I have done was to no purpose, and that my 10 volumes are worthless. So that is the kind of reception that the death of Ivan Ilyich actually received. Here I would request Professor Prakash, who's very well versed in Russian writing himself, to share his views on Tolstoy on this context.
No, two very important points you have made, Professor Payal Nagpal. One is regarding, the peasantry and the feudal class in Russia in the 19th century. And, this person being of the upper classes, the aristocracy in Russia, was, I think, sympathetic with the peasantry because the class to which he belonged had exploited it. And he knew the suffering of the peasantry firsthand. So that is very important and is to be kept in mind. And since this class had no future, later on, the bourgeois would take over, and the feudals will be replaced by them, and there will be a new working class. So this class is dying in Russia at that point of time, and therefore the kind of tragedy that you have referred to is to be understood in this context. And the second thing is that very interestingly, as you said just in passing, that he was quite popular and well versed also at the same time in the writing of Europe. Like you referred to two or three English writers, Dickens, Lawrence Sterne, and of course you later on talked about Maupassant. So which means that he is a European genius more than a Russian genius.
Yes.
And particularly in the context of War and Peace, there is as much of France in the novel as there is of Russia.
Yes.
And the acumen of the writer is such that he is able to glean wisdom out of the writing, the best writing in all the countries in Europe at that point in time. So I think if he writes this tragedy then, and in the last years of his life, then it has that kind of authenticity which would have moved people like Maupassant. So I really appreciate the point that you're making.
Thank you. And I think one of important aspect is that, be it a writer like Turgenev or be it Tolstoy, because they belonged to the aristocracy and had the means and the wherewithal, they also traveled a lot. Like Tolstoy also traveled to Paris, and I think this exposure also kind of allowed them to be more sympathetic in a sense towards, France, which was seeing a revolution every 10, 15 years. So I think it allowed them to be more sympathetic in a sense to the peasantry. And you made a very important point about the peasants dying, because despite the abolition of formal abolition of serfdom in the 1860s, it was taking time for things to change. And by the time we come to the 1880s, and there is also a kind of populism that is there. So it's true that these currents are very visible in a short fiction like The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and which is why I think Maupassant considered it to be one of his finest works. Pretty much right at the beginning, on the first page itself, there is a line that says, "Gentlemen, Ivan Ilyich is dead." So in that sense, do we call it an anti-Bildungsroman, anti-novel of sorts? And one can here, detect the influence, as I said, of Sterne, because in Tristram Shandy, the birth of the protagonist takes place much later, and here we have the story that begins with the announcement of the death of its protagonist. And at the second important point here with this announcement is that death is a very important aspect of this novella. So it's not just about Ivan Ilyich, but how to understand this word, how to understand this phenomena of life, which is death. So Tolstoy in this fiction moves from how people respond to this death, what are they thinking about in the initial section, to a brief summing up about Ivan Ilyich's life and how he got married, and what were his thoughts about marriage, and finally to his gradual deterioration that sets in and his final acceptance of death. So these are some of the important, the broad sections into which this novella is divided. And so right at the beginning, the question to be asked is, what is the response of his colleagues and people around at this death? So they are all, the first thought that comes to mind is that now his position is going to be vacant. This sense of a person dying and that position becoming vacant for another person to come there also tells us about the almost like the selfishness of human nature that is more concerned about that vacant space rather than the person who actually inhabited it. So it's as if, there is going to be this movement in the social ladder where each person gets to finally climb up the social ladder. They all move one step ahead. So the individual's position here becomes important only so that it can be taken up by the one who's junior to that person. And there is complete callousness that one sees here. The society comprises of people who are all self-seeking, and all this is conveyed in the simplest of ways. So to quote from the novel, so on hearing of Ivan Illich's death, the first thought of each of the gentlemen in the room was of the effect this death might have on the transfer or promotion of themselves or their friends. So, how there are 4 or 5 people, and each person, these are people who were his friends and so on. So, how each person is actually thinking about this. So, besides the reflections upon changes and promotions in the service likely to ensue, the very fact of the death of an intimate acquaintance excited in everyone who heard of it as such, a fact always does, a feeling of relief. It is he that is dead and not I. So death also kind of triggers, and these are also human sentiments, and very dispassionately, very realistically, he, in a very realistic manner, Tolstoy is presenting it all. And he's not passing judgment on these people, he's not imposing his view over here, but is presenting to the reader things as they are. And this is what makes this text so relevant to this date. So, the second observation he makes is that, people feel a sense of relief that, it's good that he's dead and, not I. So, with this, we also move to towards an understanding of his style of writing. So, the style of writing is very interesting because there is a very different kind of wit and dark humor that we see here. And so, for instance, when people are coming and taking a look at Ivan Illich, so he comes up with this statement. He says, "The dead man lay as dead men always lie, in a peculiar, heavy, dead way. His stiffened limbs sunk in the cushions of the coffin, and his head bent back forever on the pillow and thrust up as dead men always do." So I think this play on the word is very important here, and he's looking at a kind of grandeur and beauty in the dead man, which the other characters are unable to see. So again, here I would request
really
you.
enjoy this particular deep irony
Yes.
that is situated in
Very
the text.
dark, yes.
Very dark, and he's a dead men do. You can imagine
Yes.
that kind of paradox. The dead man cannot do anything.
Anything.
But so far as Tolstoy is concerned, the dead man is doing it. He is asserting himself.
Yes.
And that is really remarkable. And I think, in spite of not being a humorist, he's a great ironist. The way he uses irony, and as you say that he's not taking positions. So in fact, he's not taking positions is perhaps the best position at the time,
Yes.
because he's objectively presenting the hypocrisy of these people who say, well, he died, he's our friend also, but we have not died.
Yes.
So imagine the kind of insensitivity and cynicism that the Russian society at that time had created, and Tolstoy luckily was there to see it.
And to compare it to a text like Gogol's Dead Souls, for instance, where again one sees this kind of hypocrisy, especially in the landowning class. Here we move towards a different society. There are people who are in the judiciary, so they're looking at the legal aspects, and how the bourgeois class, there is a different kind of hypocrisy now that one has to deal with. So and of course the writing is realistic, but yet at the same time it's very different from, let's say, Gogol's
yes.
kind of writing. So, to say that the dead man lay as dead men always do, I think was, it's really something. So he goes on into this detailed description about his yellow waxen forehead and sunken temples and nose and upper lip and so on. But after describing all this, he calls it impressive. So, he was much changed, thinner and so on, as always with the dead, and was more handsome and above all more impressive than it had been when he was alive. So, you know,
Then
it's
he was offering a kind of
extremely
competition to the self-seekers. And now
self-seekers.
there is a relief that he's not there. So
Yes.
they can find him impressive now.
They can find him impressive, and he's also saying that, you know, probably he was more genuine in his deaths than he was when he was alive.
Yes, yes.
So this, I think, is a very important comment that Tolstoy is making on, humanity and human beings here. So how they lack humanity and how there is a need for this.
And you also see, you know, that there is a peasant in him, which is, you know, who is at that point of time critically examining the reality around him. And peasant is always very bitter.
Yes.
The main characteristic of the peasant is that he doesn't see any future anywhere, and he wants to cling to his loneliness, his solitude.
But in this solitude, in this particular story, the peasant emerges as the only one who is kind. The peasant Gerasim, who's helping them out, he's the only one who emerges as somebody who's kind.
So friends, the story has been introduced, and we will go further into the discussion, and Professor Payal Nagpal has a large number of points to make about the story, and we have reached the one part of the end of the first part of the discussion, and very soon we will pick up threads from here and take forward the argument. Thank you.